We attempt to study the self using the very instrument we are trying to understand, the self. This creates a closed loop where the observer and the observed are the same. When we look outward into the physical universe for meaning, we often find noise. We gather data points that suggest an intelligent design, yet we remain caught in a cycle of skepticism. This is the empirical illusion. We behave as though anything that cannot be measured physically is non-existent, effectively locking ourselves inside an artificial reality. Reaching a true realization requires us to stop looking at the screen. We must deconstruct our outward identity and turn our attention inward, toward the source of power. The default state of the modern human condition is the veiled ego. Relying solely on human reason leaves the spiritual center in darkness. We remain shrouded, distracted by the superficial symbols that orbit our daily attention. In this state, the mind mistakes temporary emotional impulses and passing worldly desires for a permanent identity. Shattering this veil requires the soul to undergo a direct confrontation with its own limitations. Turning inward produces immediate friction. You encounter the first degree of the soul, psychological turbulence. This is the inner storm. Waves of pride, arrogance, and destructive desire attempt to drown the spiritual center. This resistance is the nafs, the lower self. It functions as a mechanical counterweight, opposing upward spiritual movement. This diagram maps the mechanics of the self. Notice the bottom section. The nafs pulls consciousness downward toward the material world and spiritual negligence. Surviving this stage requires an internal war against these destructive impulses. If the storm subsides, the self enters its second degree. The moral conscience begins to awaken. The mind begins to weigh the consequences of its actions, feeling the sudden requirement for a structured moral framework. This threshold carries high risks. Relying solely on the self at this stage can lead to hollow spirituality or a circular, narrow rationalism. Avoiding these traps requires metacognition, thinking about how we think. We must recognize that human reason has inherent limits when dealing with metaphysical truths. This was the blind spot of the Enlightenment, the assumption that human reason could serve as the ultimate judge of all reality. Reason is limited to the empirical world. To move beyond doubt, we must look for an absolute external criterion for truth. This criterion is known as the Furqan, a revelation that operates beyond the boundaries of human logic. Submitting the mind to this revelation breaks the chains of the lower self. Through this alignment, the soul rises out of the ego's chaos toward the light. Intellect alone cannot achieve this elevation. It requires the mind to submit to a higher divine text. This brings us to the fourth degree of the self. The violent ocean of the ego settles into equilibrium. Internal rebellion ceases. The storm has passed. External trials still occur, but the internal state shifts to an acceptance of the divine decree. Peace is unlocked when the ego stops fighting for dominance and accepts its submissive position in the universe. The deconstructed self acts as an instrument aligned with divine guidance. This diagram shows the structural harmony of the realized state. The spirit, the Ru, connects directly to the divine source. The purified heart and intellect finally operate in synchronization, free from the interference of the lower self. This soul walks softly upon the earth, existing in humility and continuous remembrance. This inward journey strips away mental illusions to uncover the eternal reality that has always been present.